Jambo, Karibu, habari gani. Welcome to the celebration of the 50th anniversary of African Liberation Day. And we are pleased to have you join us this afternoon. We would have loved to have an outdoor event like what typically happens, but between COVID and here in St. Louis, we've had some terrible weather, including touchdowns of tornadoes. So probably it's good for us to be on webinar. But you know, again, Karibu, welcome. I want to make sure you know that we are going to be entertaining questions later on. But we're going to start with, first of all, a shout out to the National Black United Front, KC chapter, for co-hosting this with us and helping to do the promotions. This, you know, this is in some ways very exciting for me, and we were talking about Abdul's book before he came on, like it jogged a lot of memories about African Liberation Support Committee. But there's just a lot that we got to cover today. So I'm going to start with, first of all, we're going to do a brief history of ALD. Abdul Alkalimat, whose book helps chronicle the African Liberation Support Committee history, will come on and do a brief presentation. And I was prepared to do it because Abdul was having problems with his technical support. And I pulled up his February 3rd Black History thing that we did with Sonia Stone Center. So I was prepared, Abdul, to substitute for you. So just in terms of African Liberation Day, this has been celebrated in this country since 1972. But before then, in the 50s and 60s, not just in Africa, but in this country, there was just an upheaval of lots of struggle that was very intense. You had the civil rights struggle, you had the Black Power struggle, you had the anti-war struggle. So there was a lot going on in this country, but there was a lot of reciprocal knowledge, inspiration, information between the continent and the US in terms of Africans here and Africans in the diaspora. And so what we saw in between 1958 and 63, just a lot of activity going on and a lot of struggle. And in fact, 17 countries in Africa won their independence. And so 1960 was actually proclaimed the Year of Africa. So we still struggling here. Ours was not necessarily against colonial powers, but it was more legislative, more around civil rights. But nevertheless, we had people in the streets, we had people in action. And so out of that came the African Organization of African Unity took African Freedom Day, which the African countries had been doing, and changed the name to African Liberation Day. And that's technically celebrated on May 25th. And over the years, people have done it pretty close to May 25th, but sometimes you gotta land on that weekend. But there's also groups who celebrate a week of African Liberation Day instead of the week. And so you'll see lots of things going on. Now, I will say, and we can have some conversation about this later, that the activities aren't as robust as they used to be. I think the last big upheaval of engagement and solidarity was probably during the anti-apartheid movement, where this country was, and particularly the Black Liberation Movement was working very hard for the liberation of South Africa. And so people saw the connections between there. But African Liberation Day has always been, as Walter Rodney said, it always needs to be about Black unity internationally, because we're all over the place through no choice of our own. So we're all over. We need to always maintain that solidarity and our commonalities. And so it's been through African Liberation Day here in this country that we maintain those connections culturally, politically, that we're able to raise the issues common to both struggles. That's how people could know about Afrikaan. That's how they could know about the continued exploitation of the African continent. Just recently, President Biden sent some troops to Somalia. So all of these things impact what we know and do here. Sometimes we don't know that it does, or we don't know how it does. But it's also a day to recommit to the struggles for African liberation worldwide. There was some 60,000 people that gathered in Washington, D.C. in 1972. And, there'll be some link in the chat about the upcoming 50th anniversary of the National Black Political Convention, which had 10,000 people coming to Gary, Indiana. So I'm just giving those dates so that you could see what kind of activity and upheaval and organizing that was going on during that particular period of time. And even this month, there's still lots of things going on across the country. I have to really give a shout out to the All African Revolutionary People's Party, All African People's Revolutionary Party, because they have been steadfast in hosting and holding ALDs across the world, and have been, unrelenting in that. And so there came a time here in St. Louis where we actually co-sponsored, and they went on to do a regional one in Chicago, Illinois. But it's always been that kind of synergy going on. But I think in some ways, because of all of the activity here, we're not always in tune with what's going on in the motherland as we should be. I'm going to introduce Abdul Alkalimat, and there's going to Azizi, who's our technical support, is going to be dropping in the chat some links around that, because he has a website that's going to give you an array of things that he's been involved in. But this brother is an author. His history goes back to SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was one of the thinkers whose vision led to the Black Radical Congress and the founding in 1998. He's done a really exemplary job of trying to pull together Black studies so that it's accessible to not just academia, but to everyday folks, and particularly organizers, Black organizers. And so some of that you'll see on his website as well. So he's going to make a presentation of the African Liberation Support Committee history. Then we'll come back with Brother Kalimu and Mickey Dean, and I'll introduce them and we'll start our discussion. So Azizi, if you can allow Abdul to share his screen.
Is the screen available?
Yes, I see it.
Okay, it's a pleasure to give this talk. As Jamala said, this is the week of the 50th anniversary of ALD, and then the subsequent development of ALSC, the African Liberation Support Committee. As a veteran of this experience and the holder of its archive, it's my pleasure, indeed my responsibility, to participate in this summation. Here's the outline of my presentation, which follows the outline of the book on ALSC that I've written. The book is constructed on 3 levels, showing the simultaneous development of these tendencies. First, obviously, the ALSC experience. But secondly, the context of radical and revolutionary tendencies in the US in general. And then more generally, the final 3rd level is what was happening in the African liberation movements themselves. Sometimes history moves slow, sometimes fast. ALSC was lightning speed. As you can see, each year brought forward different context, different focus, different political focus. So as you see here, 72, I'm calling that the year of the United Front, 73, Black Liberation Movement tendencies, 74, class struggle, 75, vanguard politics. But first, just some background to add to what Jamala was just saying. First, the colonization of Africa. This map was drawn at a European conference in Berlin, 1884-85. Now, George Padmore, a Trinidadian Pan-Africanist revolutionary, said this about the Berlin conference, quote, "The German chancellor convened the conference in Berlin in November 1884, at which the powers with colonial ambitions in Africa were invited to regulate their claims peacefully. After the General Act of Berlin Conference was signed on February 26, 1885, the 3 great Western European powers, Britain, France, and Germany, started in real earnest to annex colonies and protectorates all over the continent." End of quote. Now, this map is from 1910. Note the dominance of Britain and France. Now, 50 years later, the armed struggle against the final 6 direct colonies began. Now, Ghana had led the way with its independence in 1957, followed by 17 countries in 1960, leading the UN to proclaim that Africa Year. But now check this funny story out about an incident that happened at Ghana Independence Day. Nixon went representing the US, and he went up to a black man, touched him on the shoulder and said, "How does it feel to be free?" The man turned to face him and said, "I would know, I'm from Alabama." The contradictions of the freedom of independence in Africa versus the context in this country comes out dramatically in that story. Now, each of these 6 countries, as you can see here, the years when armed struggle began, each of these 6 countries had a process of going through some form of organized attempt at negotiating, having peaceful demonstrations met with extreme violence, shooting men, women, and children down in cold blood. Each liberation organization had to develop strategy and tactics, including the secret development of an armed wing of cadre, trained and ready to fight to the death if necessary. Out of this context is where our story about ALSC begins. Owusu Sodoki, also known then as Howard Fuller, was an activist based in North Carolina and the founder of the Malcolm X Liberation University. Owusu was invited by the National Committee of Black Churchmen to attend a conference in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. At this conference, he met a leader of Frelimo who invited him to join a group that was going into liberated Mozambique. So off he went. This was not the speculation we had been doing in the US about armed struggle to free Africa. It was on the ground. It was the real deal. He marched, had to dodge bullets from airplanes while diving in the bush for cover with all the rest of the cadre who were there as members of Frelimo. Perhaps one of the most important revelations he got was about women in the struggle. He found women in Frelimo to be equal combatants in all aspects of Frelimo activity. He left Mozambique with the request to build a movement about Africa. In other words, what Frelimo said was, we don't want you to think that you can send people over here to fight with us. We want you to do exactly what happened in the US regarding Vietnam. We want a movement to support African liberation, support us, oppose your imperialist government. Now, 2 of the organizations that had developed cadre in a national structure were called by Owusu to join the effort. Out of Newark, New Jersey came Amiri Baraka as a leader of a network of progressive nationalist forces. This led to the Congress of African People held in Atlanta, Georgia in 1972. Every main tendency in the BLM was represented. Also here is Nelson Johnson, leading activist organizing Black students that led to SOBU, the Student Organization for Black Unity. Here you see a copy of their newspaper, The African World. This was one of the 3 main national movement newspapers, the Black Panther, Muhammad Speaks, and The African World. CAP and SOBU provided many of the cadre that held together the national structure of ALSC. The first move was to build a united front for African Liberation Day, 1972. Now, Florence Tate, seen here in the cover of her autobiography, was recruited to handle the media for ALD. She was a veteran professional and made a critical contribution that kept ALD with a high public image and helped to recruit the thousands that joined in. She helped train activists with media skills. The United Front organizing strategy included critical elements of the mainstream. This included members of Congress. This move was a continuation of the unity established in March 72 meeting of the National Political Assembly held in Gary, Indiana. With the increase of 13 Black members of Congress, Representative Charles Diggs from Detroit led the organizing of the Congressional Black Caucus. He became chair of the subcommittee on Africa of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He became committed to the direct end of European colonization and therefore became a force in the mobilization of the first ALD in 72. Now, Ron Dellum, seen here on the right, was elected to Congress in 1970, continuing his radical stance from ending the war in Vietnam to ending apartheid in South Africa. These two politicians were forces that helped legitimate the ALD as a united front effort. So middle-class forces felt comfortable enough to participate, including ministers at the highest level, teachers, social workers, and many others. But the base was still with the masses of Black people. ALD was a mass mobilization effort. Students and youth were critical. The staff was led by Mark Smith of SOBU and Cleve Sellers, a veteran of SNCC, and a close associate of Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael. Florence Tate, of course, was the press officer. This was an awakening in three important ways. First, it announced the existence of a militant stage of the Black liberation movement. Second, it announced a new connection between the Black liberation movement in the US with the armed phase of the African liberation movement. And third, it became a new stage of collaboration throughout the African diaspora. In the Caribbean, there were many new connections made. Here's a photo on the left of a demonstration in Antigua led by Tim Hector. Hector was the founder of the Antigua Caribbean Liberation Organization in 1968. And on the right, you see a forum that was held in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. These speakers represented the TANU, the Tanzania African National Union, the main political party that was working with the representatives of ALSC that were based in Dar es Salaam. That was 72. In 73, a decision was made to have ALD action dispersed to local demonstrations. The point was to refocus cadre to building out into local communities, bringing forward more leadership voices and expanding the United Front. Here are two examples. The top is from Newark, New Jersey, being led by Amiri and Amina Baraka, showing the leadership of CAP. The bottom is Washington, DC, led by SOBU cadre, Donald Isaac and Tim Thomas. ALSC developed to having 50 local chapters, including a wide diversity of Black liberation activists, nationalists, Marxists, non-ideological people who wanted to support the fight in Africa. The 1973 forces began to consolidate an organizational structure and a statement of principles. At a June 1973 meeting, a new executive committee was elected. Here are people who attended a meeting in Nashville. Owusu represented the southern region. John Warfield, I'm going from the left to the right, John Warfield was treasurer. In fact, the cultural center at the University of Texas in Austin, where he used to work, is named after him. Brenda Paris from Canada was the secretary. Owusu Jean Locke from Houston was chair. Akinlabi from Buffalo was in charge of fundraising. Baraka from New York represented the Northeast, and I was based in Nashville, heading research and development. ALSC began taking on more of an organizational identity and structure. And key to this was the adoption of the ALSC Statement of Principles. This document had 5 parts. 1, the worldview, African and Western Hemisphere. That's that document in yellow there. Finally got the news, toward a united front, operational unity and program. Now on this basic program, the first 3 points: raise money for liberation organization, conduct educational seminars on racism, feudalism, imperialism. In other words, educate people about Africa. And 3, develop and distribute literature, films, and other educational materials. In other words, the first 3 points there were specifically about African support. The second 3 were aimed at building the fight here. 4, participate in and aid the Black community and Black workers in the struggle against oppression in the US, Canada, and the Caribbean. 5, engage in efforts to influence and transform US policy. And 6, engage in mass action against governments, products, and companies And then, of course, the 7th point targets the annual ALD demonstrations. But this chart on the right really gets at the heart of the matter. As ALSC was getting more and more into debates and the study of theory, there never was a let-up on the practical campaigns of struggle. And you can see here the dates, and then the practical struggle that took place, and then the main debates that took place. While the debates were heating up, ALSC did not lose its focus on building a united front. Now, here is a panel of leaders of the ALSC and the African Heritage Studies Association in New York City. Owusu, myself, James Turner, Amiri Baraka, Leonard Jeffries, Gene Locke, Ron Walters, Lynn Dozier. And then, of course, there's the flyer for the event. The activists had to study and the academics had to act. Both were challenged to embrace both theory and practice. This was an important debate of ALSC and, of course, others, and it was leading in developing broad concern for all the positions that were emerging. Now, the debate over the statement of principles kept deepening and became a debate between Marxists and nationalists, the most widespread and militantly struggled out debate since the 1930s. In the green is a cover of the Handbook of Struggle for the entire month, which we call African Liberation Month. The debate was in 2 panels held at Howard University. Each speaker had 45 minutes to present. In other words, this wasn't one of those sessions where people had 5 or 10 minutes and they would always say, we don't have enough time. This was 45 minutes to lay out exactly what you were thinking and representing and what you wanted to advance as a leading tendency in the movement. Standing room only, over the seating capacity of 1,500, Cramden Auditorium, Howard University. Pan-Africanist tendencies were represented by Kwame Ture of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party and Kwadwo Akpan of the Pan-African Congress USA, based in Detroit. Revolutionary nationalists were represented by Amiri Baraka, and the All-African People's Party was represented by Muhammad Ahmed, Saladin Muhammad, and Abner Berry. Marxism was represented by me, Abdul Alkalimat of People's College, Nashville, and moving in this direction was Owusu Sodoki of Malcolm X Liberation University. In each, there was support for ALSC. Differences emerged over how to connect the African focus with the fight to confront capital in the US and fight for social transformation towards socialism. The African liberation organizations were headed in that direction, and we supported that delinking from global capital. The ideological crisis was over the fight for socialism in the US. Were we committed to arguing for the unity of Black and white workers? Was the main fight here over racism or imperialism? What was needed to advance our struggle? One of the main points I make in the book on ALSC is that there were 3 levels moving in the same way: how to transform a broad-based social movement into a more cadre-based organization capable of providing organizational and ideological leadership. Much inspiration came from third world revolutions led by Marxists in China, Vietnam, and Cuba, mainly the theoretical work of Mao Zedong, seen here. Out of a unity of older revolutionary elements from the past and revolutionary students out of SDS, there was a move to form a party building process on the Leninist model. Everywhere activists were reading What is to be Done by Lenin. The move was to form pre-party organizations as well as parties. Now, in general, the 3 main parties that had emerged were the Communist Labor Party led by Nelson Pirie, the Communist Party USA led by Mike Klonsky, and the Revolutionary Communist Party led by Bob Avakian. Each liberation organization in Africa was making the same move. In other words, inside Frelimo, PAIGC, ZANU, all these organizations, there was party development, the same thing that was happening here in this country. On this side, you see the RWL, the slide, this red cover, formed by cadre from Malcolm X Liberation University, Sobu, People's College, Lin Yusan Institute in Texas, and others. Also, you see that the revolutionary wing of CAP formed the Revolutionary Communist League, Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thought, and then went on to unite with the League of Revolutionary Struggle. Activists in a radical social movement had become revolutionary, and as such, were set on forming a serious level revolutionary organization. However, the unity of ALSC was not carried forward, but was replaced by what we called a two-line struggle. First, Marxist versus nationalist, then between different kind of Marxists. The Africa focus remained, but the party building process narrowed the network down to an organizational process, thus moving away from the broad outreach of the previous period of building a social movement. The next stage of a pro-African liberation social movement, mainly now on South Africa, including the freedom of Nelson Mandela. Randall Robinson, seen here on the right, next to Bishop Tutu, he had started out as an ALSC activist in Boston. And he made the next move that led to the forming of Trans-Africa. Trans-Africa went back to the broad leadership base of ALD 1972 and gathered in the politicians and middle-class elites in place of mass anti-imperialist base that ALD 72 then had led to ALSC. But the important thing is that the struggle continued. But without our anticipation, the situation in Africa changed. Victory, that is the independence from direct colonialism, represented for us a rather confusing state. Or we might ask, did what we get, was that victory? I'm sure there's a lot to be discussed about that. Now, the Black Lives Matter slogan rang a bell around the world and helped jumpstart a new stage of struggle around everywhere, really. Now, here's just some examples: Ghana, South Africa, Nigeria, London. This time, the capitalists have decided to drown the movement leadership cadre with money and transform everyone into being dependent on the NGO money, meaning NGO approval process, applying to get the money and writing acceptable reports to keep getting the money. We used to volunteer, but now movement activism can be a career with a healthy 5-figure income. Times are different than they were during ALSC, and we have to make sure that a radical possibility is maintained. Independent thinking about freedom still exists, obviously, and I hope this presentation stimulates and is the basis for useful food for thought. Just to end these comments, I end the book by talking about these 10 lessons that I think come out of ALSC that we really need to think about in terms of the movement today. First, that Black people in this country support Africa. And of course, that becomes difficult because it was easy to support the end of direct colonialism. Today, it's an open question as to exactly how do we support the forces that are aiming for social transformation, for social justice, and so on. Black studies, universities have Black studies programs. They're an asset. They don't always act that way, but they're an asset. The BLM needs a Black left. That is, needs the perspective of what the enemy is like, what the nature of the system is. Black media is key. Mainstream forces are needed. In other words, the Black middle class, we have to see the Black middle class as partly our allies in the radical movement and partly as the opposition, but we have to look at that in a dialectical way. Unity is needed. Ideology is important. Professionalism in carrying out the movement is important. All regions of the country, especially the South, is important. And of course, we have to pay attention. Dealing with ALD 50 years ago, many of the activists today are in their very senior years, And we need to really pay attention to the survival of the activists and the need for respect and healing as we live out the final years of our lives. So, thank you. Let's have a conversation.
Thank you for that presentation, Abdul. It was a lot in there. I wish we could have given folks what folks got back in the day, that 45 minutes, and maybe have a couple of hours for some additional discussion. But I do want to, before I introduce Mickey Dean, I do want to say that one of the things I think at the time that many of us were inspired by, and that is the messages of Malcolm X, as he got us closer to embracing our African identity. And not only that, actually encouraging us to take our plight as a Black nation to the United Nation, as well as connecting on a more official level with African countries. And one of the things in your book reminded me of that. And at the same time, we were going through some of our archives in the Organization for Black Struggle, where we actually had correspondence with heads of state in Africa. And I don't think we have that now. We don't have that like sort of head to head. We got folks going over there as tourists, but we really don't have people operating as a official entity, you know, state to state. And so I think that's one of the things that I think is definitely missing. But OBS generally would celebrate Malcolm X African Liberation Day together, but because this is the 50th, we said we would go invoke his name, and because he's so much a part of African Liberation Day. And next up is Mickey Dean, and Mickey was one of those young students in the streets up there in DC. He was part of the SOBU, Students Organizing for Black Unity. He's been instrumental in a number of organizations. He was part of the founding of the Kansas City Black United Front. He's currently working with the KC Reparations Coalition. And so just a lot of things that this brother has done. At some point later on in his life, he decided he wanted to go back to law school, and he did. It's having another tool in the arsenal for our liberation. So Mickey, your first, your response to the presentation, and then I'd like for you to talk about your role in ALSC, and then how you all celebrated African Liberation Day in Kansas City.
Thank you, Sister Jamala. You know, my first response in listening to Abdul, it just reminded me of how intense our movement was at that time. We were young people, you know, I was 19, 20, 21 at the time, and the movement was very intense. We read a lot. I mean, I know that we would get into debates, and one of the questions was, well, have you read? You know, and if you hadn't read it, you know, we didn't want to talk to you. And so it was that what we call the polemical struggle, but there was a high level of understanding of what was going on in the world. And the thing that hit me in listening to Abdul, here in Kansas City and Edinburgh, we've had a leadership transition. A lot of the founding members, we've sort of taken elder status, and we have a whole young leadership. And one of the things that is really missing is that somehow we've not been able to connect them to that history, because that history is important in terms of what our movement tried to do at that point in time. And so we have a lot of young people in our movement who are very dedicated, who simply don't understand the history of revolutionary nationalism in this country. And that's where we try to center ourselves in the Black United Front. So I think that we have to do a much better job of bringing our young people up to date in terms of the history of this movement. As far as my involvement, I was involved with SOBU at the University of Kansas, which eventually became YOBU. And of course, we were part of the debate in ALSC, that the whole shift in focus and the whole discussion around nationalism, Marxism, et cetera. YOBU eventually left KU, and we went to different places. I and some others came here to Kansas City, and we left at KU. We left the February 1st movement, which was the student part of Yobu at that time. And so I came to Kansas City. There was not an active presence of the African Liberation Support Committee in Kansas City at that time. In fact, at that time, as Abdul mentioned, we had become the Revolutionary Workers League, and really had sort of was engaged in another type of movement. But that was a very important time, I think, in the development of the movement. And I think, did you ask me about ALD today?
Yeah, how have you all celebrated ALD in Kansas City throughout the years?
Well, what happened was, at first, we just basically participated in various ALDs around the country. I know we went to Denver, I think in 1973. We participated at the Howard Conference in 1974. When we came here, we didn't do African Liberation Day until the founding of the National Black United Front. And in NBUF, we had ALD, we would have a marching rally for ALD every year. And then after a few years, we tagged on Malcolm X Day, and we would have an African Liberation Day Malcolm X weekend. And that night, that Friday night, we would have a forum, and we had people like Chokwe, James Turner, Lynn Jeffries come to town. But we had a very robust African liberation movement, and of course, the focus at that time had shifted from Southern Africa, and we talked about what was happening in Africa and also domestic type issues. But we haven't done African Liberation Day for a while, and so I was really glad to see and glad to get the invitation for us to co-sponsor this.
So I'm going to bring Kalimu into the discussion. Same question, your initial reactions to Abdul's presentation, and then how OBS celebrated the ALD over the years, and what your role was in the African Liberation Support Committee.
Okay, the first thing I want to say is that, I think that the Dialectics of Liberation, that it's a must read. I think that everybody needs to read it because going back to what Mickey said, when I got involved, I was like, what, about 21, 22 and stuff like that. And so all this stuff was going on. And so then it was exciting times. It was times you had to really always be trying to keep up with what was happening, and stuff like that. So, so for me, for Black Liberation Movement veterans, it's a must read because it allows you to go back and reflect upon all these things. You don't have to be in agreement with everything that was said, but it'll allow you to remember all these things, because I think it's very important for us to sum up our history.
Right.
We have to keep on deepening our understanding of where we came from in terms of our struggle, where we're going. And I think what Abdul laid out in his book, which I did read, and I'm gonna try to get another read of it because it deserves another read, is, everybody needs to do that, because then you will realize, because I think one of the things he said also in the book is that this is a marathon, and I ran a marathon. Me and my wife, we ran a marathon. It's hard. You have to train for it. It's difficult. You want to give up and stuff like that. And in the middle of the race, you still want to give up. We say, oh no, I can't give up. And then it's one of those stories. When we were trying to finish our marathon, we were like about a couple miles from the finish line. These white folks came to us and said, we have a shortcut for you to take. We said, no, thank you. Because we want to run the whole marathon. Because that was our thing, because we had trained real hard for it, because it takes a lot of work and stuff. And the thing about it, when you get through it, you say, wow, I ran that one marathon, but still, we ain't won this victory. We got to figure out, well, what does it take? And that's why this kind of discussion is necessary, starting off with his book and Kamonzi's book, and other people need to be inspired to write books about their experiences, because we have a wealth, 400 years of experience of fighting against this imperialist beast that we live inside of, So that is, my thing, because, we have to really understand the fight. And the veterans, of this struggle, we need to pass it on. But we need to have clear, concise stuff called books that people can go out online or get audios and stuff and check it all out. So to me, that's my response to what I heard him say. Unfortunately, like he had on 45 minutes to say more because he had a lot more to say. Then the second point is my involvement. And I have to first of all start off with saying, I can't speak about my involvement in the African Liberation Support Committee without making clear my work was guided by the dynamic leadership of the Congress of African People. You know, because that was one of the key organizations in the African Liberation Support Committee. So when I came in, that's when I stepped into, you know, became one of those cadres who believed in the work that we were doing. And, you know, it's like, okay, this is what we have to do. You know, and, you know, but I have to also say, I have to raise my fist up in praise of those folks, some of who have joined the ancestors, you know, and the others who are still with us, and letting them know, but we still fighting. That's the one part, because they still carrying the banner forward, you know, the torch, you know, for our fight for Black liberation and revolution. So that's how I have to say in terms of my involvement. That's why I'm still involved. As y'all can see, I'm about as old as everybody else on this call here. But I provided leadership to a very dedicated cadre of sisters and brothers in the St. Louis Congress of African People. Without their tireless work, there would be no successes of our African Liberation Support Committee work. And in the St. Louis CAP, we were a leading organization within the St. Louis African American Liberation Support Committee. We participated in many national meetings, conferences, and demonstrations. It was a lot of long rides with no airplane trips and stuff like that. You got there with your no-dos and your coffee and stuff like that, and try to stay awake in those meetings and stuff like that. That's how it was back in the day, but we was there, you know. And we worked hard to implement the national plan of the African Liberation Support Committee because we believed that, you know, this was what needed to happen. So that was, you know, that was our commitment in St. Louis. And of course, Jamala, she was right there. She knew what I'm talking about. But then, like, you know, we went on to found the Organization for Black Struggle in 1980. And since OBS's founding, the African Liberation Support has been an important area of work for us. You know, as members of the St. Louis Black United Front, we actively participated in the cultural boycotts, campaigns of the singers who perform in South Africa. With the Free South Africa coalition, we boycotted the Kuluran and fought for divestments of US companies and universities, the ones who were, like, you know, making their money off of apartheid. You know, we supported, like, you know, the activities and coalition with, like, with All African Revolutionary People Party in St. Louis, their annual things. Also, OBS, you know, from us, so we had like these annual celebrations of our organization, and included like themes that were related to contemporary struggles in Africa. We also had speakers from Africa, or just speakers like from here in the United States that spoken that, because we always thought it was important to link the local struggles up with the international struggles, in particular with Africa. So this has always been like part of what OBS has always done. And then, like, you know, as Jamala made mention to, we've had annual celebrations of Malcolm X's birthday, because that's about self-defense, self-determination, self-defense, and self-respect. You know, we've always had that in conjunction with African Liberation Day. At our monthly community meetings, which we call promotion sessions, and the program gives the community an opportunity for the various activists, because we always try to make sure that everybody that's in the Black liberation movement in St. Louis, they come out, let the community know exactly what they're doing, so the community can see if they're going to participate in it and stuff like that. So that's what we have been doing, and we still doing it, because we think it's important that it's not some kind of academic discussion, but it's something that, like, you know, we as organizations, we try to make the folks that see the community understand, like, what's happening in Africa is the same thing happening to us, and we have to, like, support each other and stuff. And let me just wrap this up by saying, like, but I'm also a member of the Infrared Rockers, which is a reggae band. But we used to be called Infrared Funk and different names and stuff like that. We part of the album project, like with Casey Buff and stuff like that. We've always had this positive music. And it's been the message in our music. And our music always has been about, supporting like the fight for liberation in South Africa and all over. We had a song that we did like with a brother over from the Cameroon called Liberating Nelson Mandela, and we have a song called Refugee, a whole lot of different songs. And so through our music, recordings, we have always been in support, and we're going to still be doing that. So my thing is, we still involved. So that's what I'm involved with. Once again, here's the other part. This go back to what Mickey said. Our task right now is how do we pass this on to the next generation? That's the problem that all of us are facing right now. How do you pass on all of what we have learned to the next generation as we get ready to get in our wheelchairs and our crutches and things? That's it.
So thank you, Brother Kalimu. One of the things that you and Mickey and even Abdul reminded me of is some of the streams of organization went through organizations. So under the Congress of African People, for example, where we worked with ALSC, and then we actually founded the Organization for Black Struggle. Some of the cadre out of that were founders of OBS, and we continued ALD. So there was this continuity of these themes that were very important to the movement back then that sort of has gotten stifled because there's not another generation to keep it going and to make it as robust as it was in 1972 when we had 60,000 people come out. So so we have a few questions that people want to ask of you, but I would be remiss in telling people that Abdul talked about Florence Tate. There were other sisters who were involved and had key roles in the African Liberation Support Committee. They were not always in the photographs, but you had sister, like Brenda Parents, who was on the executive committee, and many more on the local level, including people like myself. So I know that's the first thing people say is, where's all the sisters when they see the photographs? Because they asked that even with the National Black Political Convention, because you had all the brothers and the luminaries up there. The sisters was working. They were the worker bees. But some of that sexism and some of that making sure that women, had their rightful roles, thankfully has been struggled with over the years. And so you don't see the same kind of like in your face, all brothers and the folks who are also doing the work are not there. One of the questions that has been asked of you all is, what is necessary today to carry the struggle for African and Caribbean liberation? And Mickey, one of the things I thought about when I was rereading the book is when we talked about having relationships with people in IMBA, we had a formal relationship with the New Jewel movement and Brother Maurice Bishop. And it wasn't like we, some little social thing. It was like some clear political. And so that doesn't really exist now. And so we don't always know who the forces are in some of these places. As Abdul pointed out, when you go to Africa, it's so confusing for somebody want to support South Africa. Again, who knows? I mean, they have gotten totally corrupt. And so where do you start? So I guess that's where that question is emanating from. So anybody can jump in. A couple of minutes, please, so we can answer as many questions.
Well, I'll just say this very, very briefly. Last year, I had a chance to go to Kenya and with some brothers and sisters. And what was interesting is that there was not a single discussion about the history of colonialism in Kenya, the history of the resistance struggle, Myanmar, et cetera. And so what you're seeing is that there's a renewed interest in Africa from our people, but it's mostly, I guess, from a cultural standpoint. We always talked about Africa in the sense of the liberation movements, and I guess that now, because I think, as Abdul mentioned, most of the governments are neo-colonial, we don't see that independence movement like it was at the time when they were fighting direct colonialism. And so I think that all of the organizations that exist, including NBUF, should at least have an international affairs section. We have an international affairs sector that's actually based in Tanzania right now. And I think that it's very important that all of our people begin to understand the importance of the detriment that imperialism has done to the African continent. And then the final thing I'll say is that we have to, because I'm always looking for where's the new independence movement in Africa. Everywhere I go, I'm trying to find out who's fighting against neocolonialism, you know, in Africa at this point. And there has to be some kind of connection, hopefully, on the continent for all of those folks that are fighting neocolonialism. But I would say, I encourage people to study some of the stuff that Abdul talked about. What happened at the 1884 meeting in Berlin? And I would encourage people to read two books among many. One is Kwame Nkrumah's Africa Must Unite, because there he sort of lays out a framework of what a unified Africa can look like and its importance. And then secondly, his book, Imperialism, the High Stage of Capitalism, which I think is very important to understand the current conditions in Africa. And maybe somebody needs to write a book called Neocolonialism, the High State of Imperialism, because we really need to understand what's going on in the African continent now and why it is the way it is.
I'd like to follow what Mickey was just saying, make 4 points. The first point is there are progressive forces in Africa and in the Caribbean that we need to hook up with. For example, in South Africa, there is a tremendous motion among the proletariat in South Africa challenging the alliance of COSATU and ANC and the CP of South Africa. There's also the shack dwellers, the homeless movement. So there are forces fighting. There are progressive forces in the Caribbean fighting, Trinidad, Jamaica. And so we need to have direct connection with them. That's the first point. The second point is, and you know, both the brothers made it, you know, we need to study again. So we need study groups. What should we do? Form study groups. And it really almost doesn't matter exactly what you study, because once you start studying one thing, you're going to start studying a lot of things. So study as a new way of recreating a political culture of intelligence, of curiosity, of knowledge development. That's because ignorant people can't make a revolution. That's the second thing. Third thing is, we obviously have to pay attention to fighting US imperialism. In other words, studying the government in this country, studying the corporations in this country, studying the international organizations that this country is pursuing, NATO, obviously, World Trade Organization, et cetera, et cetera. But lastly, we need to start talking about how to unite ourselves. We have splintered. Now the question is, can we come back together? January 6th was a dress rehearsal. We are facing a rising, united fascist movement. If that's happening, then why can't we figure out a way to unite? Develop a workers' program, develop a Black liberation program. That's what ALSC did. And it was useful. We need that process again. In other words, unity is essential for us. And so we have to get off of our individual ways of defining ourselves in isolation from each other and try to figure out where we can commonly agree. Not on everything, obviously, but enough to create a political motion that can deal with an enemy that is rising. Remember this. I mean, think about the 2024 election. Hitler was elected.
Yeah, we do have to remember that. And we also have to remember that Trump is trying his best to get back in there. And if he does, I think we will see a more defined path to fascism. Kalimu, did you want to speak to?
Yes. You know, and so first of all, I want to agree with what both of the brothers have said. But what I want to add to it is that, see, this kind of a program, I think should be the beginning Because like, you know, with most of our movement, it's been a series of events that we have used to build up our forces in terms of ideological understanding, political unity and stuff like that. And so, like, you know, brother Joseph Jordan, he said back January the 2nd, you know, he sent out a letter and he laid out, you know, the whole process of how, you know, he thought that we should start looking at having these kinds of, you know, get-togethers. Might be 10 people, 100 people, whatever the platform is, it don't matter. But we can, like, you know, really understand the lessons from ALD, ALC, and move our struggle forward. And so I think that this is part of that process right here, that this is not just a feel-good session that we're having, but something that's going to move us forward. But I really do believe that we have to understand that, like, the work we do in the Black Liberation Movement, part of it, our work is internationalism, and that's the work that we do in support of Africa and everybody else that's oppressed throughout the world. And then I think, like, you know, going back to the Black Radical Congress, point number 15, you know, which calls for us supporting, like, you know, people who fighting, you know, fighting against oppression and stuff. Y'all check out that particular point, because OBS, you know, that's part of our platform. You need to be doing that as part of your mass work. And then, like, you know, so, you know, I was like, I think those are the main things.
Okay, I know we are nearing when we say we were in. I'm going to ask, if people don't mind, another 10 minutes. We have, I think, some really good questions that we want to pose to the panelists, and then we'll close out about 4:10 Central Standard Time. Well, one of them is a suggestion, and I think we do have to seriously take it up, and that is, would we be willing to host an online study group? And I would say that's probably sounds like the easy thing. But I also know that any of this stuff calls for work and time. So, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. So I'm just going to say that, but it's something I think we'd have to discuss among ourselves at a later point in time. So this is a question to you, Abdul, and then we're going to move to some more broader questions. And that is, do you remember the Toronto Black Weekly called Contrast? There was a May 1972 issue that had articles by Muhammad Ahmed and Horace Campbell, and probably a number of other folks from the US, but I think it points to the sort of the international scope of ALD and African support, that those people in places wherever there were some African folks were connecting. So are you familiar with that Toronto newspaper? You're on mute.
Generally, but the point I wanted to make in response to Jalali's question is, there were younger people, as we all were then, in Canada, who became involved in the movement and then went back home and became important political players, one of whom was Rosie Douglas. You raised the Grenada comrades. There were people from Jamaica. So Toronto, Montreal were important centers. And just as we were having conferences, they had conferences. Now, the question is this: how are we networking with the people who are here studying, who are likely to go back home and become involved in the struggle? That's what happened with ALSC. We do have people like Horace Campbell, for example, from Jamaica, who stayed in Black Studies here. But that's the whole point about that that connection. And then, of course, people like Muhammad Ahmed. One of the brothers made this point. I think Kalimu made this point. The veterans of our struggle are libraries of information. And we have to figure out a way that they can become much more available and much more used by these younger people. I think the point that Mickey made about people don't know the history. We have comrades who are living examples of the history, but they're not being put in a position of educating. And of course, the younger people need to be encouraged to listen. This is a rare opportunity to hear the veterans of struggle tell their stories. And without those stories, the struggle never happened.
Right, exactly.
We'll lose it. We'll lose our memory.
And that's the sad part. And that's why the oral history, I keep telling folks, yeah, that might be the African tradition, but that don't always work in 21st century. You need to write it down so it can be passed on. So one of the questions that's been asked is, how do you find allies of this movement? And can you have allies in non-Black communities? And I think any one of you all can speak to the fact that there's always been a role for non-Black folks in our struggle. So whoever wants to take that. So the question is, what's the role of non-Black allies in this struggle and in this movement?
I'll give you one example. Back in the mid-'80s, this was during the height of the anti-apartheid movement. We formed, Black United Front sort of led the efforts in Kansas City, but we formed a group called the Anti-Apartheid Network, which was trying to unite everybody who would oppose apartheid. And of course, we were trying to get pension funds to divest and some other kind of stuff. But, and actually we're talking about doing the same thing with Black reparations here in Kansas City. I mean, we have to lead this process and set the course, but I think we would invite everybody who believes in Black reparations to join in our effort to support us. So I think that, I think we have to, as Black people, make sure that we're independent, make sure that we lead our own movements. Folks can't join our movement and try to get to the front of them. But I think there are certainly issues that we can agree on and that we can actually work on together and get support from others outside of us.
So Mickey, one of the things that's the theme for All African People's Revolutionary Party is dismantling of neocolonialism. And they're talking about Africa, but in the US, we got neocolonialism going on too. And so the struggle for self-determination and for dignity in cities, Black cities where there's particularly Black majorities, there are a number of motions that are going on, whether it's the reparations movement, whether it's the police accountability movement, whether it's court reform, the prison industrial complex. There's a role for people to play, and I think often, particularly white people, say that they don't know what they can do, but clearly when you see injustice, there is a plethora of stuff to be done, even if it's just write a letter to your alderperson or your congressperson. But I think this may be a time when there's so much going on that you kick off like 3 things. Here's 3 things you could do to support the reparations movement. Here's 2 things you can do to enforce police accountability. Because all over the place, I mean, May 25th next week, we're getting ready to have an anniversary of the George Floyd murder, the assassination. So it's going to send up another wave of like, what can we do? What can we do? There's plenty to do, including hold police departments accountable, to change policies that target Black folks and use them as target practice. So I'm just saying there's a lot for non-Black people to do.
I'd like to raise this idea strategically that if we're talking about fundamental change in this country, we're talking about the convergence of the national liberation movements, Black people, Latinx, etc., and the workers' movement. And we see that dynamic, for example, with the recent victory of the Amazon workers, because the Amazon workers were people from many diasporas, led by Black people. So in thinking about who is the enemy and what do we need to have to fight, you better start thinking about what is the nature of capitalism, what is the nature of the government and its relationship to the corporations, and what kind of force do we need to go up against that? So, for example, I'm working with the Southern Workers Assembly. You can Google that, Southern Workers Assembly. And we're developing a workers program for the South. And it will have an implication for the whole country. but Black Workers for Justice, there are many groups throughout the region in the South that are connected to this. So I want to even get the echo of ALSC, this notion of Black liberation and the notion of a workers' movement. Think about it, Amazon workers, Starbucks workers. I mean, there's a new labor movement developing in this country, and we have to connect to it. At the same time, we have to make sure workers represent social justice so that they come and support the struggle against police violence and other issues that are particularly attacking Black people.
So Kalimu, if you could make your comment and then we're going to close out, I would ask that people, if they want to make announcements or want us to know something, they can drop that in the chat. You could pull out some of those links, particularly how to buy Abdul's book, get to his website, get all that good information he's got stored on that website. But there's a lot in that and people are sharing some things. So make sure you go to that before you leave, and we'll close out as soon as Kalimu makes his comments.
Okay, 2 quick points. I really believe, people, they should really check out the 10 lessons at the end of Abdul's book, because that really sums up what we need to do in order to move forward. That's the one thing. The other thing, like see in OBS, we believe like that, as long as you are Black led, then you don't worry about the white folks. We need them, because there ain't no like wall between us and white people like in our community in St. Louis. And so we all come together and fight against the common enemy and stuff like that. So therefore, that was back there then, now, and we all have to come together and fight. But we know that Black folks, we are in the lead because we are on the bottom of the totem pole, So that is, I think it's important that, we need everybody that opposes our oppression, because it's common oppression.
Right.
So I appreciate and feel honored to be with you, brothers. I've known you, all of you, for a long, long time. And I feel like I'm at home. And there are a number of folks who had made comments in the chat that have also been a part of this struggle. So I think there generally is a follow-up Zoom, and Azizi can correct me if I'm wrong, and then we might poll people to see how interested you are in being a part of an online study group. That seems to be something that I think maybe even Mickey, we could get some young people to do with some, I mean, all they got to do is go to Abdul's website and pull off some videos and some, I mean, like it's some stuff like all nicely organized there. So, and we can help facilitate, them getting the information. But I think because we need to also bridge that generation, that having them do that and utilizing some of the technological advances that they're more privy to than we are would be extremely helpful. So I'm going to thank the folks who, like I said, spent their Sunday afternoon with us. Remember, 50 years of African Liberation Day. That's a long damn time to do anything. And some folks didn't even live that long, some of our brothers and sisters. And so, so we want to say a luta continua. The struggle continues. Hopefully Quenu stays safe out there. And if there's going to be a follow-up to this, we definitely will let you know. So thank you, Abdul, Kalimu, and Mickey for participating.